And we are live. This is the Dev Book Club. We're going over Chapter 4 of Robert Martin's Clean Code, a handbook of agile software craftsmanship, if you're into subtitles and such. Tonight we're talking about comments. I am joined by Bo, our good friend Bo. How's it going, man?
It's going all right. It's going quite all right. I got to be honest. I thought this chapter was going to be 2 pages long, and it wasn't.
Yeah, it sounds like it should be, right? It's like
Yeah.
comments. Here's my position on comments, and we're done.
Yep.
But no, I mean, I think I really appreciated that about the chapter because he did, kind of go through. Here's my whole picture of comments. Like
Hmm.
here are my thoughts based on my experience and things I've seen, and it wasn't just you typically get, you're talking to someone who's teaching beginners, and they're like, comment everything, and then
Hmm.
you get the other person that's like, don't write comments. Comments are useless, and there's nothing to back it up.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought it was good.
Yeah, definitely. I found myself nodding through pretty much all of it, and then also like feeling kind of justified in some of my opinions in some places, and then also feeling bad about my opinions in other places. Just to have it all laid out like that, it was pretty nice.
Maybe that's the brilliant thing about writing what was it, like 10, 15 pages, but writing a fairly exhaustive list of examples of comments. Maybe that's the way to do it. You can get some people to agree with you, some people to disagree with you. So I think that's
Yeah.
not bad at all.
Yep.
Yeah. Something that I found particularly interesting when I was going through was when he was talking about Java docs or PHP docs, that type of thing.
Hmm.
And something that I've always, or that I think I've kind of flipped back and forth on as I've gone through my career has been, whether you document private methods or not.
Hmm.
Like to the same extent that you would a public API that someone else was consuming. And I still don't know what my exact opinion is. Like I mean I think that it's usually, for the way I write code anyway, a waste of time to go through and have, an extended, here's all the parameters, here's their types, here's a brief description of them, here's some examples of how this method is used. Because most of the private internal methods that I'm writing, I feel like they're really fairly descriptive about what they do and what you should expect. So at most, I would want to document maybe the types and the return value at most. So I found it interesting that he talked about that in here about don't bother with it, or that's kind of what I took his opinion to be.
Hmm. Yeah, the Java doc part. I recently worked on a project for a client of a client where there was the possibility that the part of the part of the code that we were working on could be released open source,
Yeah.
and the guidelines or the requirements of doing so apparently was doc blocking literally all of the things, both private methods and private properties, and basically everything had to be doc blocked. And that package was the first time that I'd exercised the make everything a function as small as you can.
Yeah. So
And
you're busy writing comments.
I was writing comments everywhere. Like this package had probably 50 different functions in it. So, and because of the nature of how that works when you make these really small functions, and I had really explicit names, the comment for what it did was taking the camel case name and putting spaces between them, the parts. It was exactly what it was, and the whole time I was thinking, this is just pointless. Like
Hmm.
this is not helping this code be more legible at all. I'm not able to make it more clear by adding comments, and in fact, if I have to change the method names, chances are I'm not going to go in and change the actual description. So, about the only place that I find it useful, at least for PHP, is with the type hinting for IDEs, just
Yep.
because since PHP is loosely typed, you can't. Yeah, it seems like editors have a difficult time figuring out what you're doing unless you give it a hint. So
Yep.
I've been a little more flexible on that, so I can see that point in the Java doc. But for the most part, if you're writing methods like that, like the PHP doc, does absolutely nothing to help the code.
Yeah, I mean, I do like it for, so an example it would be like if I was writing some sort of, library that was used internally to interface with, some sort of some other piece of code that we have, and so we're writing an abstraction library for, a different team or, some another developer in the future, whatever, to use. I tend to write kind of examples of how the code should be used or how it was intended to be used,
Mm-hmm.
in comments. But I only do that for the public method, like the public API that kind of explains here's the design of this, especially if it's maybe not super intuitive why it's there. If I couldn't figure out a better way to name it or whatever, I will put the examples in hopes that either it will trigger me to rename it to something else and I can get rid of the examples, or someone else can come back later and say, oh, this is how this is used. Maybe I can change this to a different name or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the only, I mean, that's the time when I really get into the whole, let me have a, 20, 30 line comment doc block that's
Mm-hmm.
everything. Other than that, I'm like, get as much of it out of the way as possible. I'd rather, your code kind of make sense and I be able to see it all or see a lot of it in my window. I'd rather not, oh, let me dig through this and figure it out by comments. I'd rather figure it out by names.
Mm-hmm.
Or that's just my opinion, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought something that was kind of tied to that, which I wrote down, which is when he was talking about good comments versus bad comments, and the example used was scary noise, and he was saying, he gave the example of someone who had gone through with essentially Java docs or PHP docs. See this a lot, where you're documenting this is the variable and this is its type and this is what it does, and then someone had they wanted to add a new variable to that class, so they just copied and pasted one, obviously, and then changed the name of the variable, forgot to change the comment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, that's obviously scary noise because it's sitting there and it's a noisy comment. You don't really need it if your variable's named appropriately, or if your property is named appropriately.
Yeah.
And it's wrong. It's just wrong.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why I always, am wary of making that into a policy. But I
Mm-hmm.
understand why people do it, especially like you mentioned with, IDEs and trying to figure out types of things.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult, so maybe the comments help.
Yeah. Yeah. The one thing that is nice is if you're using, well, it depends on where you're doing the IDE type hints. But if you're doing it with parameters, usually there's like post-processor sort of things where like you can do like the CS checkers that will be able to find those for you and say, hey, your doc block is saying it's this type, but you're actually type hinting this type. So at least there's some tools there that can help you sometimes. But yeah, you actually have to leverage those in order for them to not shoot you in the foot.
Yep. Yeah, one thing I had to laugh at in this chapter, just because I was thinking back to a person I used to work with, when he was talking about commenting code out, and he was like, "Don't do this. This is very, very bad. It's not an appropriate use of comments." Well, I worked with this guy a while back, and he was a new developer, and I mean, not that there's anything wrong with new developers, but he was learning as he was making this application he was working on. And so like, he would come and, he would ask me a question about something, and then I would, okay, well, I would probably do it like this and explain it or whatever. And then he'd go back to his desk and he'd work for, an hour or whatever. And then he'd be like, hey, can you come look at this? And I remember the first time I went over and he showed me the code he's working on, and it was probably, I mean, I'm just going to make up a number, but let's say it was like 1,200 lines, this particular file he was editing. It's 1,200 lines long. And I'm looking at it, and there's probably 30 lines of code in there, and then the rest is comments. And what he had done is, as he tried different variations and different approaches to things, he had like a running history in the file. So it was like the very first line was when he started, and it would be like, I tried this, and he'd have the date on there, and he's like, I tried this, and this didn't work, and then I tried this, and then like put throughout that file that was like, Jeff said he would do it like this, but I didn't understand it, so I tried this, and like he had, it was interesting at least.
Mhm.
But I was like, dude, what are you doing? And he's like, well, this is how I keep track of what I did. And he goes, because a lot of times I'll start going on something and then it'll break, so I'll just go back to the one ahead and start over. And I was laughing as I was reading the commenting out code thing, because I was like, I remember when I finally explained to him that he could use source control to do this for him.
Mhm.
And it's like, don't I was like, if you ever find yourself thinking, I'm going to comment out this code, it's like, think to yourself, I should make a commit with this, or I should, think differently. And and he's like, oh, so I can go back and look at this over time. I was like, yes, you can. You can go back to whatever version you want if you really want to. And he was like, oh, so it was just, it made me laugh because it was remembering. But that's that. I think everyone's probably done this at some point in their lives. It's like, this code I maybe don't understand, or it's not working for some reason, but I don't really want to delete it because I don't understand it. So I'll just comment it out and see what happens.
Yeah. So I actually still do that. I will just straight up say I do that. I was actually listening to some of your older loosely coupled episodes. And I
Hmm.
think you mentioned that at one of your projects you had uh, you would create test files, and you said you were basically doing the unit test anyway, but you weren't able to use any of the tools. So
Yep.
you'd have like a file that had like a running thing of everything that you're trying to do.
Yep.
I have those as well, and I have those set up such that once it gets to a certain point, I'll comment them out and then start over again, either with a different part of the code or redoing the code in a different way. So I've done like I wouldn't say that I do that in actual source code for the project, but
Hmm.
just daily working. If I have a little test file where I just want to write some pseudocode for a little bit and see if it works, I'll comment it out and start over again. So that was one of the sections where I read that I'm like, yeah, I do that sometimes. I don't feel bad about it though. Like I don't feel like that's all bad all the time. But if it's like in a library file that you're going to be checking in, or if it's a part of another application where coworkers are going to see it, I can see how that would not be good.
I think that's the distinction, right? Like in the process of doing something, I think it's okay. But once you get to a point where you're like, I'm kind of done with this, or they shouldn't be hanging around, in my
Yeah.
opinion. Like, it's confusing because then, if you've got a section of code that you've commented out, then you have to add a comment to the top of it that explains why you
Why it's
commented.
commented. Yeah.
Otherwise, people are going to be like, why is this commented? And they're just going to delete it. So or hopefully they'll delete it. But that's another chapter, I guess. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think it's fine. You know, I, I don't know. I think it's it's dangerous to tell someone it's okay to do this, because I feel like unless you qualify why you're saying it's okay, in very specific situations, it ends up with the, oh well, I was trying to push this up, the build was failing, I commented out the test, everything's fine, or I commented out this line, it now works, so I'm just going to leave it.
Mhm.
And I try not to promote that sort of thinking, because I'm like, if a test is failing, or if a certain line is causing some test to fail, or causing something to, you know or you probably won't know if it'll break something, but you know it's causing some sort of issue, instead of just commenting out and being like, oh, that's done, figure out what's going on instead. Like,
Yeah.
maybe the test is broken, like maybe the test wasn't doing what you expected, or whatever. But research that instead of, oh look, I commented out this second half of this line, put a semicolon here, and we're set.
Yeah. What did you think of the order of delivering good versus bad? Did that come up in your reading at all?
What do you mean by the order? Like the fact that
Well,
he went through
he
good
introduced
first?
good stuff before the bad, like the good comments versus the bad comments.
Um, I don't know. I don't think it really bothered me any.
Mhm. I
I
don't think
think
it bothered
it's
me either. It surprised me though. Like I was expecting to see more bad stuff because he starts out basically saying there's no good reason to do comments, and then he starts off with here are the good reasons to use comments. Like I think it surprised me. I wasn't expecting that. Maybe that the overall feeling I had of wow, there's like a lot to this chapter came from the fact that he led with don't use comments or probably hardly ever what you need to do, and then but if you do them, here's what you should do to do them right. I thought that was kind of cool.
yeah. I mean, I think that's a. I would say it's a good way to present it because it's like you know give somebody the good example first. Like give someone here's what you should be doing,
Hmm.
and then tell them okay, now that now that you have like an understanding and you're on the same level or like the same thought process, let's look at some worse examples, I guess. Not necessarily bad examples, but worse examples. I think that's a good approach because it's if you I guess if he led with the bad examples, there's just been, well, that's obviously wrong. That's obviously wrong. Instead of putting it in the context of what's actually right
Yeah.
or why. So I think it's a good setup.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know. Like I felt like you mentioned this earlier, but I felt like a lot of this chapter I was kind of going, I agree with that. I agree with that. I agree with that. So it's like I don't know that I necessarily learned anything. I think it was more just reinforcing things that I thought of, or I've read this before, so maybe it was just I've read it before, so I just
Hmm.
recognize everything in there. I don't know, but I didn't really feel like it was a wow chapter.
Yeah, no, it didn't seem like a WoW chapter. Definitely. The thing that I took away from it was, a lot of it was, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's what I've been doing. But I also got a sense that some of the conflict that I had, where some of it was like, yeah, I wish more people did that, or no, I don't understand why that's bad, sort of made me feel like it's a little more holy warish than I
Mhm.
realized, because it kind of reminded me of the people who are doc block all the things versus the people who are don't doc block anything unless you absolutely have to. Maybe you can add the at test doc block annotation in test, but otherwise don't put any comments anywhere. Um, it was. I feel like there was a lot more to it, and there's a lot more that like there's like different groups of people who are in different camps that might lean one way or the other, to the point where I'm not sure how you would get around some of this, because if you're in an organization like where I was just describing, where you have to doc block everything, even down to the private methods, in order for it to be considered complete. There's if that's the organizational requirement, and you're against that, there's really nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to have something where it's very clearly, yeah, that makes sense. I don't think we should do that. But then at the same time, there are a lot of people who hold opposite opinions to this that you can't really just force the way that you want to do it.
Yeah, I think the longer I do this, job, I think the less I tend to look towards absolutes as the answer. Like,
Mm-hmm.
anytime you find yourself saying, you know, never write doc blocks, they're dumb.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a situation where doc blocks make perfect sense,
Mm-hmm.
and you're gonna wish you had them. So it's like, I tend to stay away from the rules that are so set in stone and more of a take the I've read some style guides people have written, and instead of saying you must always have this, or you must never have more than 120 characters, it's like you know it's a general guideline that 120 characters online is not that great of an idea, but it doesn't mean that you can never have 120 characters. It just means try not to shove three statements into one line. Like use your common sense. What
Mm-hmm.
if that even exists? But use what makes sense to you at the time. Don't sit in. There's like a tribunal that's going to come down and look at your code and see if it fits in with all the laws. Like that's
Yeah.
absurd. So I've got a question. You kind of brought up tests.
Hmm.
This is kind of a religious thing, I think. What do you think about commenting your tests, your test code?
Well, again, this was the same place where every method needed to be doc locked, and that wasn't just the public source code or the public API. But it was the private methods in the source code, the private protected and private methods, but also in the test directory. Every class has to be commented. And of course, there's like some that will like filter through. But if there's a new class or something that's added to the test directory, oftentimes it'll get flagged. For the particular package I was on, I was instructed all the way through the tests and everything. Everything had to be doc blocked. So, for my part, I've worked with Broadway quite a bit from Candidate, and they have their own guidelines, and I think they say protected and up it. And I think I don't recall if that one might have gone through their tests. I had much use in personally documenting test code. About the only exception would be if you have a really complex data provider or something where it makes sense to say, okay, this is why this array of arrays is set up in this way. It sort of gives someone an idea of, this is how it's going to be consumed, and this is why we're building it. I can see some of that being useful, but I don't know. It definitely doesn't have the same. I don't feel the same urgency. It's meant to be super usable or reusable in such a way that someone has to look at it and understand exactly what's going on. Ideally, you have a test method and maybe some supporting methods that you're calling into. It doesn't have to be documented beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of in line with my feelings. Like I tend to err on the side of if your tests are so complicated that no one can understand them, no one's going to maintain them. So you should need to have exhaustive documentation for what your test code is doing. Like you're lucky in the respect that since it isn't it isn't really production code. You can take some shortcuts and kind of get around. I tend to favor less dry code inside tests when it's something where it's like, yes, I could move this out of these two test methods and make it into some other component somewhere else, but now I've got more indirection going on. So now to understand the code I'm trying to test, I have to understand the test code that how this works. So I've got to understand this whole separate architecture essentially of how this is all built together. And so I tend to err on the side of keeping things simple and not getting to a point where you need to have 15 lines of comments throughout this method to understand how the test works. And it's like it's too complicated. And if I always tell people when asked or even when not asked, I tell people that are getting into testing, I'm like, if your tests are really difficult and really complicated to write, that means the code you're testing is too complicated. So instead of starting to refactor your test, figure out if you can actually refactor the code that you're trying to test. And that has always served me well for identifying hotspots in things that are doing too much, because generally if you have a lot of setup going on in a test, that either means you've got things super abstracted and you don't really have any tools to help you, or you've got something that's doing 50 jobs, and so it needs 50 dependencies configured in just the right way to return just the right data. Otherwise it all explodes. So I always tell people, listen to your test, like listen to what they're saying. So if you find yourself writing a lot of comments in there, you find yourself saying, I don't know what this is doing, I'm going to dry it up and I have to make a whole class just to return the data, you probably have an issue. Like you probably have a problem.
Have you used a test framework in a tweet?
I have not used test framework in a tweet.
It is amazing.
Okay.
Are you aware of it?
I think I saw a mention of it, but
Yeah.
no, I haven't looked
Uh,
into it.
it lives in a gist. It's by Matthias Verais.
Okay.
Right. And yeah, it's pretty fun because it's one method that you call, and I've used that a bunch of times in the kind of files that I'm talking about building, and it really helps keep things easy
Mhm.
because you can do your inline construction of your dependencies and then just the function call underneath of it and say it does something, and if it's true it passes, and if it's not it doesn't. So I found sometimes starting there really keeps things simple, especially if you're just prototyping code anyway and you're not really ready to commit to building the package, for example, and creating your test suites and doing all of that. I found that can be a nice way to force yourself to not get too involved in building a test framework, basically, like a test building framework for your things, because you only have one method and you're doing it all inline and there's no classes. So
Yep. That's cool. Yeah, I just went and looked it up. It looks pretty interesting.
yeah. Speaking of refactoring and tests, the other part of this chapter that sort of talked about that was I can't remember which section it was in, but when he was talking about people leaving comments because they're frustrated, and it was with the try catch block.
Oh,
And
yeah.
basically the idea was that if that person had spent that time rebuilding it, it was actually in the noise comments where he'd done him or her had done a try catch block on an exception, and then they had to do another try catch inside of the exception handler, and then there was some reason they're like, well, if this gets exception, I'm not going to do anything, and so they had to write a catch block 3 times, and so the comment was like, why am I doing this? This is just awful, and had they spent that time instead of writing a crummy comment to refactor it to bring that out into its own method, it wouldn't have been as bad. I kind of liked that idea.
Yeah, I think that's another that's another example of or I guess why I kind of flip back and forth on whether I like or hate comments, because it's like at some point maybe you should think to yourself, this comment isn't fixing the problem.
Yeah.
It's masking the problem at best.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I've worked in code bases where something incredibly complicated is going on, and so you look at the code and it reads like a story. Like there's not the code, the comments. Like there's like a we did I did it like this. This is the first step. This is the second step. This is how this works. This is where this goes. And it's like if you would spend half the time that you spent writing those out and formatting them, if you spend half the time making the code simpler to understand or breaking it out into separate methods that are, that I can just read, I would be happy. I would much rather come in and see a method that used to be 300 lines with 400 lines of comments.
Mm-hmm.
I would much rather see it be, 5 method calls that are just, the helper methods that are doing the actual work, and I read them like, set this up, go filter these out, do this, do that, and then finally return the calculation or whatever.
Yeah.
I would rather see that instead of having to read a short story of your life in comments, because that takes a lot more time. It's that's one of those things where it helps you in debugging, because you feel like, or I guess the instinctual response is, oh, the comments are going to help me in debugging because they explain the why. They explain the why of this code.
Mm.
But in actuality, you have to spend the time parsing that. Where if I knew that the problem was, a certain piece of data is being filtered out, and I see a method that says filter out this, I'd say, oh, let me go check that method out. Then I can go read it and figure out what's wrong with it, instead of, okay, so step 3 here says something, and we've got this for loop here, okay, and then there's another comment here, okay, where's the actual code? Like it's taking
Yeah.
minutes of my life.
So I don't want to keep coming back to this library I wrote, but I'm pretty excited about it because I felt really good about it, right? And I just pulled it up. It's still in a private repo, but it is 837 lines long. And I had a suspicion that I wanted to check just now. But the first thing I wanted to mention was there is not one single else block anywhere in this code,
All
which
right.
was an interesting side effect that I hadn't even realized until after the fact. I had one else block in, and the person who did a PR review, one of the main things that they pointed out on that library was that else, like there was something weird about it. So I took it out. I had made it into two methods, two additional methods, and now there's no else blocks. That was the only else block, and that was one of the big things
Nice.
that got flagged. The other thing is, I just looked, and there are no comments. I did not put any comments in this code,
That's good.
and it's interesting that basically I was following, chapter 2, and just trying to see how that worked out, and it worked out very well for this particular task.
Hmm.
I don't know if I'm always going to be able to do that, but a byproduct of boiling these things down to the smallest possible unit was that I didn't have to comment it. I didn't feel like I had to comment any of it. So other people looking at the code may be like, you should have commented it. I have no idea what's going on here. But for me, when I look at it now, I fully understand it, and there were no comments. I didn't like the method names were all very clear as to what they were doing, and there's a good flow. If you start at the top, you can walk all the way through it. And yeah, anyway, I thought it was interesting that I just looked now to see. I wonder if I had to comment that library, and I didn't. I don't have any / comments. It's all of the required doc block comments that were basically the function name with spaces instead of camel caps.
Yeah, and I think I think someone, maybe I did, I don't know, someone mentioned this, while we were talking about that, and that's kind of the point of, breaking things into methods, is
Mhm.
so that it isn't confusing, that it's very intentional what's going on. Like you can read it and understand, even, even as simple as, you've got like a real life process, and you can read these methods that tell you essentially how it would happen in real life, like how a human would do it, as opposed to
Mhm.
just, a computer. Like, how does the process actually work? I can read, here's this method that has four methods that it uses. I understand that, as opposed to, here's a method of 30 lines. Now I've got to read these to figure out what it does.
Yeah.
Because we are not compilers. Well, maybe some of us are. I don't know. I think that's pretty much all I had out of this chapter.
Surprisingly, a lot, which I, uh, I thought that was awesome. There was actually one thing that I was thinking about throughout here that um, didn't come up here because it was Java, and Java doesn't have this in a problem. But I was thinking about annotations in PHP
Mm-hmm.
are handled in doc blocks, and it reminded me of the argument from certain groups within the PHP community that code shouldn't be driven by comments. Claiming that doc block is a comment, so you shouldn't ever have to worry about looking in comments to figure out how the
Mm-hmm.
code works. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing about that argument is, the reason they're comments. Like, annotations are a very powerful tool to help you from, a bunch of boilerplate usually, and,
Mhm.
other things that you could consider wastes of time, as a developer. But, the reason they're comments is because they, no one has figured out a good way to implement native annotations in PHP
Mhm.
itself. There was a proposal before, but the problem was just it was too. I think it was too.
It was the actual implementation that was the problem.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what was wrong with the implementation. It wasn't the idea. The idea was okay. It
Hmm.
was the way it was implemented. I forget what it did, but,
Hmm.
anyway, like, so that's why they are comments. Like, you have to have some way of getting the annotations, and you can't just litter your own random syntax into the file, that's not going to compile. So you have to have something that can compile and something you can reference.
Mm-hmm.
So doc blocks are what we have. So I understand, or I think I understand the negative viewpoint of, well, this is theoretically just a comment, because I've been places where we actually stripped out comments from certain code because it had some remarks that were not appropriate for public consumption, essentially. We'll just leave it at that, and the code needed to be released publicly. So rather than going through and cleaning up all the references, just stripped out as much as we could and replaced them with other things. But I can see some of the argument for, since they are just comments, it's a problem. But at the same time, I don't think that that's a legitimate reason for saying annotations are bad. Like they're only comments because of the implementation in the language. If you go to other languages, annotations are native things. They're
Mm-hmm.
not just comments. So I like the idea of annotations. I like the idea of anything that saves time and effort. Like,
Mm-hmm.
time that you're not spending on writing mappers or whatever. Like if you can let the computer figure it out, I'm all for it.
Yeah.
That's time solving more important problems. We've already solved that problem sufficiently enough that we can let a computer do it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's solve bigger, more important problems now. But I understand it. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
It wasn't a question that needed an answer. I was just curious if that was one of the things that came up for me in this chapter, was that conversation that I've heard so many times of people saying code shouldn't be configured by comments, and I want to ask these people, is it annotations that you have a problem with, or that it's implemented as comments? Because the line is blurred when they start going off about how these are so horrible. Um, anyway, since this whole chapter was on comments, it would have been interesting if annotations in comments had been a part of the language that he had been writing about.
yeah.
If he would have addressed that. But unfortunately, Java's awesomer in this particular aspect, so that didn't come up at all.
Well, it's okay. I was reading on Twitter the other day that PHP is becoming Java again. So
Yeah, it is. It is. There's like a featured list somewhere of all the things that are remaining in Java that PHP does not yet do. I think generics was the last one that Anthony just solved. So
nice. Yeah. All right. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about?
no, I think annotations was the only thing that came to my mind that we didn't discuss otherwise.
Sweet. All right. So that was chapter 4 of Clean Code. We're going to be doing chapter 5, which is. Give me a second.
Yeah, formatting.
Formatting of code. Yes.
Yeah.
So we're doing chapter 5 in 2 weeks from today, which I don't know what day that is, but we'll look it up and schedule it. So hope you can join us if you're listening. Hope you can join us too, Bo. That would be awesome.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. All right. Well, thank you very much, and have a good night.